November 6th is just around the corner, and one of the most important decisions you'll have to make if you live on Oahu is who you'll choose for the next prosecutor for the city and county of Honolulu. Now, this is a race that hasn't received that much attention in the media, but we want to let you hear from Kevin Takata, who is one of the candidates. He's a deputy prosecutor, and he is already working with the state attorney general. He's been with the prosecutor's office in the past, and we've had him on the show before. I want to welcome him, and thank you for coming today.
Thank you for having me, Malia.
Yeah, and we did have Keith Kaneshiro on, who's the current city prosecutor, with you before, and we had a good debate. I thought it would be nice to have some more time with both of you, but unfortunately he wasn't able to make it. So I want to give you the opportunity, since we're just days away from the election, to have people get to know a little bit more about you.
Thank you. Well, I was a deputy prosecutor for over 23 years. During that time, I was fortunate enough to win the most homicide cases in Hawaii. I was also the trials division chief for 10 years. That's the largest division in the office. During that time, I also trained prosecutors in Hawaii, nationally and internationally. I had the privilege of being invited this past June to train prosecutors from Mexico for the third time. It was a privilege to be part of this historic effort to bring the rule of law to a country torn by violence. At the Attorney General's office, one of my responsibilities included being the commander of the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force. This task force investigated and prosecuted those who deal with child pornography or who try to victimize Hawaii's children.
Great, okay. Now, you were at the prosecutor's office for how many years?
23 plus.
And your specialty was really prosecuting murderers.
Yes, I did that for over 20 years. I've worked on some of the most high-profile cases. I assisted Mr. Carlisle in the Xerox prosecution.
So very high-profile cases. And you had a very good conviction rate.
Yes, I don't know what the percentage is, but over 20 years, 20 plus years, I only lost 2 murder cases.
So that's pretty good.
Thank you.
Okay, so in terms of why did you leave the prosecutor's office? Maybe you can share a little bit about that.
Well, I didn't exactly leave. I was fired by the present incumbent, given a week's notice, and then I landed over at the Attorney General's office. And I continued to prosecute cases there, different types of cases, under a different title, Deputy Attorney General.
Yeah, and so what was the dispute over that why did he ask you to leave the office?
Well, you know, I didn't know until there was an article recently where Mr. Kaneshiro claims that the reason why he fired me was for the way I handled a case when he was prosecutor. Now, this was never told to me. I read it for the first time in a newspaper, and I don't understand the rationale because, first off, that was over 15 years ago. I didn't believe that someone would hold a grudge that long. Also, the case he cited, and let me give you the background of the case. There was a defendant who was convicted of murder. There was another he was in prison and he was convicted of a murder that occurred in prison. He filed what we call something like an appeal. Now, there was a mix-up in the paperwork, and due to that mix-up, he could have just walked out the front door and just run away. But his attorney told him, don't do that. Stay there, and we're going to fight this through the system. They did. The paperwork was corrected, and he remained there. So his attorney called me and said, Kevin, you specialize in homicides. This is the situation. Please take a look at this case. Now, I was skeptical at first because I've heard that many inmates profess their innocence. And the easiest thing for me to have done was to let that file sit on the shelf and collect dust, but it intrigued me. Because here's a guy serving a life sentence, and he didn't walk away when he had the chance. So I pulled the file, and I realized there was scant evidence to support the conviction. I believe, and his attorney believes, that he was convicted because his trial attorney was ineffective, didn't do a good job. But yet this defendant refused to raise that as an appeal issue because he liked his attorney. So I thought, this is amazing. He has an opportunity to prevail on appeal, and he's not using it. So the defense attorney at the time on appeal, he asked me, Kevin, can I use your name and ask the governor for a pardon? I said, well, I don't think the governor even knows who I am, but if it's going to help, go ahead. So he did. his sentence was reduced, and he was released. And using that as a basis for firing me just doesn't make sense, because it's a prosecutor's duty to seek justice, and that's what I did in that case. I don't think anyone can really accuse me of being light on crime or soft on crime. Having won the most homicide cases, it's clear that when I believe that someone is guilty, I go after that person. But that was the reason given to me.
What governor was that, just out of curiosity? Was that
I'm not
Waihee?
sure.
Yeah, I'm just wondering because it's been brought up now about, Governor Cayetano was just on the show and he was being criticized for having the most pardons of any governor. And so we actually talked about that during his show and said that he has the highest, not the highest percentage at all, only 50% of the applications before him, that came before him, did he grant. But the other governors have had many more pardons than him. So anyway, just interesting that you mentioned the pardon. Yeah. Okay, so tell us about what is it that is going on in the office. You've been very critical about the management style of Keith Kaneshiro as a prosecutor. Why are you so critical of him? What is it that bothers you about the way he's a manager?
His mismanagement of the office has caused 55 out of 105 deputies to leave. And that's what compelled me to run. And what also compelled me to run is the reason why some of them left. They left because they were told to do things that were unethical. Specifically, they were told not to turn over to the defense evidence that hurts the prosecution's case. We call that exculpatory evidence. This evidence consisted of inconsistent statements. That's statements that a witness makes and then says something different. For example, a victim may say, I was hit on Monday, and then I was hit on Friday. Now, the reason why those statements are so important is because it goes to the credibility or believability of a witness or victim. And that determination is made by the jury whether to believe that person. And that is used to determine guilt. So the defense is entitled to that information. And the prosecutor is ethically bound to turn it over. So some deputies left because they realized if they followed that directive, they put their license to practice law in jeopardy. And if they didn't, their jobs were in jeopardy. So instead of facing that quandary, they left. Mm-hmm. Now, Kaneshiro denies saying that, but in an interview with one of your reporters last July 12, he admits telling 2 deputies not to turn over inconsistent statements. So his own words betray him. And what concerns me is that for a prosecutor to admit to unethical conduct indicates to me that the prosecutor doesn't know the rules of ethics. So you cannot be an ethical prosecutor unless you understand and know the rules of ethics.
Right, and that reporter was Jim Dooley, who writes with Hawaii Reporter and works with me there. And he's a very well-known reporter, very, very good crime reporter, has been around for many, many decades reporting. So he's very credible.
Well, yes, I like Jim a great deal, and I respect his professionalism and his ability.
Yeah, so he documented something that someone else, that no other media did anyway.
Right.
Right. Okay, and so what else is it about that you want to do differently or that you see taking on if you become prosecutor?
Well, to retain and attract skilled, dedicated prosecutors, you need to treat the staff and the deputies well. That's one thing. Another thing that's happening, and I don't know why, is there is a regular transfer of cases from one deputy to another. And people may think, well, so what? The so what is that when it's transferred, the deputy who receives the cases has to relearn them in preparation for trial. Trials are won before a prosecutor walks into a courtroom. So with the regular transfer of cases, you are putting the deputies in a situation where it's very difficult to win. They have to learn a new set of cases, get prepared, and they're less prepared in the courtroom as a result of that. What has also happened is that specialized teams are not staffed the way they should be. And I would point specifically to the sex assault team. Now, Kaneshiro claims that it is fully staffed. It's not. There are basically 3 deputies there handling cases, and their loads are too heavy. He may cite to 2 others being on the team, but the fact is those 2 other deputies are assigned not to just sex assault cases, but to specific courtrooms. Now let's talk about that too. Under Peter Carlisle, we assigned cases to deputies rather than assigning deputies to courtrooms. So deputies had a range of cases and they had to go to every courtroom. The American Bar Association recommends assigning deputy prosecutors to specific judges. The reason for that is when you have a deputy prosecutor only in one courtroom, there's the danger of collegiality between the deputy and the judge. If that happens, then deals may be struck based on that friendship or that relationship, which wouldn't be in the best interest of justice. So 2 deputies who are doing some sex assault cases are assigned to specific courtrooms, but those courtrooms don't have only sex assault cases, so they have a mixture. Mm-hmm. So in essence, there are only 3 deputies where there used to be 5 or 6, and that is hurting the prosecution of sex assaults. Also, the loss of deputies from the office has impacted the win-loss rate of the prosecutors. Let me give you an example. Through the Freedom of Information Act, we obtained data from the Criminal Justice Data Center. We had to pay for this information. What we learned recently was in the domestic violence abuse cases, prosecutors are now winning less than a third, when the nationwide average in general is double that. Based on these concerns, that's what compelled me to run.
Now, why do you think they're winning less cases? I've heard that that the courtrooms are so overbooked that cases are getting dropped and they have to be refiled and things like that. Do you think that's attributed to it, or do you think there's some other reason?
That's part of it. When cases back up, what happens is that they sit too long before the case goes to trial. And when they sit too long before they go to trial, a defendant's right to a speedy trial is violated. When that happens, judges are compelled, they're obligated to dismiss the case. So they have to dismiss the case. So cases are being lost that way. Also, because of the loss of deputies, they're moving quickly through the office and not getting appropriate training. So these are just but 2 factors contributing to this win-loss ratio.
Right. Okay, and there's another issue that the prosecutor brought up when I was interviewing him about child abuse, that we're seeing sex abuse against children. You're talking about, domestic violence and sex abuse in general, but specifically domestic abuse against children is on the rise. And we have domestic violence on the rise. So there's a lot of crime to deal with in Hawaii, more so than maybe in the past. How do you see tackling that?
I don't think the numbers bear that out right now. I saw a recent article saying that at least in the first portion of this year, violent crime in Hawaii has dropped.
I think the violent crime dropped, but this was specifically, he just gave me the numbers recently, that the child sex abuse was up and over last year, and domestic violence was up over last year. And maybe the other kinds of violent crime is down to balance that out. But I was just wondering, what are your ideas to deal with those kind of violent crimes?
Well, assuming those statistics are true, again, you need skilled, experienced deputies to make sure that the defendants are prosecuted and convicted. The police investigate crimes and they arrest defendants. But in order to ensure the public's safety, you need good prosecutors to obtain convictions. And that's what's necessary. Hawaii is still a relatively safe place, but my position is with a good, effective, ethical prosecutor's office, we should and we could be safer.
Now, one of the agendas, I guess, of the current prosecutor is he says sex assault against children, domestic violence, animals that are hurt, and then elderly abuse. How do you see yourself working on those issues as well, or expanding them, or how do you, if you took over, what would you do differently?
I don't know if that's true. Again, for the sex abuse, I point to the understaffing. For the elder abuse, I would note that the prosecutor, Mr. Kaneshiro, specifically took a case involving the death of a 97-year-old lady who died in a fire set by a burglar. Now, he had the opportunity to seek a term of life, but he didn't. He pled out the case, so I don't know how that protects the elderly. Regarding child abuse, of course, as the former commander of the Internet Crimes Against Children, I understand the horrors that are committed against children and the long-lasting effects. That has to be a priority. As for animal cruelty, I love pets just as much as anyone. But we have to understand that that's a misdemeanor. So in the priority of things, yes, we will prosecute those cases, but I don't know if I would put it at the top of the list.
Yeah.
Another thing I would like to emphasize is white-collar crime.
Right. Now tell us about what kind of white-collar crime do we have in Hawaii? What are you seeing? Is it, I mean, that is in a sense tied into elderly abuse because they're getting defrauded of their
Right.
life savings, right? But what do you see in terms of white-collar crime that's happening in Hawaii?
I don't know the numbers, but based on my understanding, I don't think we have enough prosecutors in the office dedicated to prosecute these crimes. They have one very good, experienced prosecutor.
Chris Van Marter, right?
Right.
Yes.
He's doing an excellent job. But I don't know what type of resources Chris has. We should have more people assisting him to prosecute those cases.
Now, there's a lot of fraud going on. I mean, I get scams sent to me all the time, just on my own email, asking me to give money to this, or I just won this lottery, or, and I get, phone calls with people trying to scam us. And there's so many people out there targeting business people, they're targeting the elderly, and just the average citizen. Is that the kind of white-collar crime you mean, or do you have other kinds of crime that you're thinking of?
Note that those type of crimes are included, and to fight those type of enticements or attempts at committing a crime, what the office needs to do is go out and educate people. Explain, look, this is what's going on, or this is what could happen. So be aware, be on the lookout for these types of scams. Another thing that I would like to improve is just that connection between the prosecutor's office and the community. We had an award-winning community prosecution team. Unfortunately, those prosecutors have been assigned to other tasks. So they're not doing what they used to do and did very well, which is go out into the community, not only to educate them on what's happening and the new types of or new ways of committing crimes, but also just to learn what are the problems, what are your concerns. They would go to neighborhood board meetings and bring back that information to the office. But that's not happening. The prosecutor's office has to be connected to the community.
And so there's white-collar crime, there's violent crime, crimes against children and animals. And what other kinds of issues does the prosecutor's office have to tackle?
I think right now it's basically an issue of management. Another thing that needs to be changed is the way the investigation division is being run. I understand that they may be engaged in their own investigations. That division is intended to support the work of the prosecutor so they can be more successful. Their primary responsibility should be to locate witnesses, especially reluctant witnesses, and make sure that they're in court. Sometimes when we get a case, there's not enough photos of the scene or we need a diagram, they can do that. So that type of change needs to be made also. As to focusing on other types of crime, I think we have to look at computers and the internet. With advances in technology, unfortunately, not only does it improve our lives, but it puts new tools in the hands of criminals. So we have to keep abreast of what's going on. For example, in the human trafficking area, I understand that there are advertisements on certain sites for sexual services. We need to start investigating those types of crimes.
That's a good point, because we've had some people on the show that have talked about sex trafficking, especially of minors. I know I've talked to parents who've had their own children trafficked because they have special needs, and it's very difficult to get these people prosecuted, it seems. But we have all these brothels just operating openly, and some with kids in there. And I'm just wondering, why does that continue to happen? What is the challenge in trying to prosecute, say, a brothel or a pimp?
The challenge is to get the victims and witnesses to cooperate. They're afraid. they're afraid that there's going to be retaliation from whoever is doing this to them. So we need to protect them and give them the opportunity to testify. Unless they feel safe, they're not going to come into court and tell us what we need to convict that person. We also need to educate people in the community as to what signs to look for to identify these type of businesses that are operating maybe right under their nose. Say, look for this. When you see this, maybe you should let the police know so they can investigate.
Right. Well, we documented, we actually walked into 3 brothels with our video camera and tried to talk to the mama-sans at 350 Ward Avenue. And we interviewed somebody who helps victims and we actually interviewed one of the girls, one of the victims who was underage and working there. She had already been working there. And basically confirmed there's underage girls there, they are brothels and what they do. But it's operating openly right across the street from Sports Authority, and it just doesn't seem like there's that much community effort or policing effort to stop these massage and relaxation parlors.
If the community knows what's going on, perhaps there would be more pressure to investigate, arrest, and prosecute these cases, and that's what should happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, okay, so in terms of some other priorities that you might have if you got the chance to be running the office. First of all, give us an idea of the office. How many people work there? And you were mentioning 105 prosecutors.
That's on average.
Mm-hmm.
The staff is close to 200. That includes the core group of prosecutors, victim witness counselors. And my management style is different from the incumbent. I believe in a management style that's bottom up rather than top down, and let me explain. One of the things that a good leader has to do is to lead by example and understand the problems and concerns of the people he's leading. You need to be a good listener to do that. And that's one thing that I would do if I'm fortunate enough to be elected. I need to listen to people and say, what are the problems? How can we solve it? How can we do this job better?
Some of the complaints that I've heard come out of the office and the prosecutors addressed with me is that there's training on Saturdays and that they don't feel the training's effective. Some of his deputies don't feel the training's effective and so on. Have you heard those complaints and what would your plan be to work with prosecutors in a better, more collaborative way, I guess?
Thank you for reminding me. That is something very near and dear to my heart, and that's training. Training has to be appropriate to the skill level of the deputy. So if someone walks in the front door, their training is going to be different than someone who's been there 5, 10 years. First, you have to recognize that. So you don't make everybody go to the same training. You also need people who are capable of doing training, and I believe my background lends itself to that. And I think we also have to work in conjunction during these austere economic times with prosecutors from the neighbor islands. So if need be, and we can bring in someone from the continental U.S. to do training to help us and to spread the cost around. That also needs to be done. What I would also like to see happen, and I've spoken to a staff member from our congressional delegation, is to recreate or refund the National Advocacy Center. This was a center in Columbia, South Carolina, where I was an instructor, where prosecutors from all over the nation would come to train for one intensive week. And we had a beginner's course, we had intermediate and advanced. What happened during this time was there would be a lecture followed by a hands-on practical portion where you were videotaped. So you got to see your own performance and critique yourself. And there was vast improvement during that 1 week period. Unfortunately, because of the deficit, the federal deficit, this center was closed down for locals and state prosecutors. But there is talk of bringing it back, and that's what I would also like to see. But I think at the local level, working in conjunction with the neighbor islands, bringing back people who have the ability to teach is really critical.
Now, some people have endorsed you, some people from different philosophies, different parties, and so on, even though your race is nonpartisan.
Right.
But tell us a little bit about some of the people who have endorsed you.
Well, I'm proud to say that my endorsements include retired Justice Stephen Levinson. He became a so-called fan of mine during a trial where I couldn't get a plea deal from Mr. Kaneshiro. I didn't believe the defendant was guilty of the charge. It was attempted murder, and the victim's injuries were very minor. I knew I couldn't do anything except go to trial, so I did. And in closing argument, I asked for a lesser offense, and he was convicted of that, and justice was done. And I got the respect of retired Justice Levinson. I also have the endorsement of Mark Bennett, the former Attorney General for 8 years under Governor Lingle. And I'm very proud of that too, because Mark was known as a very staunch supporter of law enforcement, and he remains so. I also have the endorsement from the brother of a murder victim. This was one of the last big trials I did. The victim, Evelyn Luca, was found unconscious along the H2. She died a month later. The crime went unsolved for 8 years until a computer matched DNA that was recovered from Evelyn with DNA that the defendant had to provide. Now you may ask, why did the defendant have to provide it? If it was unsolved, you don't have a suspect. He was a convicted murderer. He was convicted of murder in the early 80s. He was paroled 15 years later. 3 years after his parole, he commits this crime. So as a convicted felon, there was a program where he had to provide a sample of DNA. When he did, the computer matched it, and he was convicted. So I have support from that victim's brother.
Oh, that's good. Okay. Now, we're almost out of time, but I wanted to have people know, first of all, the bottom line is people want to know, are you going to be able to make the city safer?
Definitely. And I don't think it's going to cost much of anything. I think that's also important. It requires a change in management style, in leadership, providing real leadership to the office.
Maybe you can tell people where they can find information about you.
Thank you. Please go to kevintakata.com. In the upper right-hand corner, there's also a link to our Facebook page, so you can see what I've done, what I've been doing, the support I have. Our Facebook page likes have been growing astronomically in this last 6 to 8 weeks. And we're reaching a lot of people, and we have the momentum, and we hope to carry it through the election.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on the show, and good luck on November 6th. And we'll see what happens, and maybe we'll have you on again.
Thank you for this opportunity.
All right. Thank you. This has been News Behind the News. Thank you for joining us. Aloha.